Hello everyone and welcome to Biodesign Now, where we'll uncover the latest visionary solutions shaping a greener today at the intersection of biology, design, art and technology. Hosted by myself, biodesigner Akir Hall, and biodesigner and artist Kirsten Tingle. And joining us for episode 1 is Chris Bellamy of Biocrafted, an engineer and biodesigner and a self-described generalist that has over 10 years of experience in human and planet-centric design and sustainable product development, all the way through from conception to marketing. His work has involved sustainable product development in the automotive, footwear, and outdoor equipment industries at brands like Salomon and Jaguar Land Rover. But more recently, Chris has been nominated for the Mullen Lowe Global Nova Award for his graduate project in MA Biodesign, Marama Aura, aka Lucid Life in Tahitian, which is a blend of Polynesian traditional knowledge and science. Now, thank you for joining us today, Chris. Congratulations on graduating and on your award nomination.
Thank you. Yeah, beautiful summary. Thank you.
Right, let's jump right into our quick fire questions and get everyone warmed up.
Okay, I've got a few lovely little quick fire questions for you, Chris, that we think all biodesigners are going to enjoy. So just to start with, what's the best organism that you've collaborated with?
So I think the organism I'm enjoying collaborating most with at the moment is actually Willow. And the species I'm working with at the moment is called Salix cinera. It's a white willow. And it's interesting because I think a lot of people wouldn't immediately jump to this when you're thinking of biodesign. I think in biodesign, we immediately jump to thinking of microorganisms. And I think, willow is a macroorganism, which, you never really hear that term bandied around. And I think it being a macroorganism makes it a lot harder to work with. It's kind of operating on our human scales. So it's a lot easier, it's a lot more challenging to guide it, to work with it, to shape it. But I think overall, plants are just the most remarkable things. In terms of their resilience, their adaptability. And so one of the reasons I love Willow, I've got a long history going back with it. My granddad, he was planting I think it was a bean row, he was planting in his vegetable garden. And he stuck a little bit of willow as a marker in the end. And that willow started to grow and shoot. And I think that's, it's amazing that you can take a cutting of a plant that will then turn into a whole new plant. I think it's just astonishing. Anyway, that then has grown into this enormous willow tree that we, had in our family garden growing up. Oh, wow. And so I've always had this kind of very deep connection with willow. And I'm kind of astonished at the moment by how adaptable and resilient it is. Mm-hmm. One of these projects I've got going on is to create these living willow chairs.
Which are so beautiful and look so sturdy and so strong.
Yeah, and so we had this exhibition on the exhibition road outside the Science Museum, and they had, I think there were 35,000 people attended, and they estimate that, I think we maybe had, close to 1,000 kids come and sit in the chair and have a photo, which was an amazing thing for them to not just kind of see nature or experience nature, but actually to sort of use or be with nature. But it was so hard for me to see these chairs that I'd crafted. And, you've got these kids coming up who are kind of used to this idea of sort of they can take something away or bash something or break it and push its limits. And so they came up to these willow chairs and they'd be like bouncing in them. They'd be picking leaves off them. And I was having a fit because these things are like my children.
Yeah.
But then the amazing thing is that 2 weeks later, they've completely regrown, adapted.
Wow.
All the leaves are back.
Mm-hmm. They've
and
regenerated.
They're so tough. Yeah. And so, it's kind of, it's lovely to see that. For me, Willow right now is something that I'm really fascinated with because there's also a long heritage of working with it. When I started this project in French Polynesia, which I'm sure we'll discuss in a bit, a lot of people challenged me and said, whoa, you're looking at someone else's traditional knowledge before you're looking at your own. And so that sent me on this bit of a journey before I felt comfortable going back out to French Polynesia to look at, okay, what's my indigeneity? What's the traditional knowledge that I should be aware of or have? And one of those things was, looking at, obviously my research is around living materials. And so looking at, British use of living materials. And originally I used to people to say, oh, what's an example of a living material? And I could only really think of the root bridges out in Asia, which are, this amazing, example that's been, of this amazing tradition of creating these living organisms that are functional. But then I started to think on it more, and you look at, actually the long history of willow sculpting in the UK. And then you go back even further and you look at the history of hedge laying, which is this amazing art of people creating these very strong, resilient hedges for protecting livestock. And then actually you look even further back, you think, well, just a hedgerow in itself. Would you rather have a fence where you have to hammer wooden posts into the ground and they have to be replaced every 10 years because they rot off and decay? And you look at a hedgerow, and a hedgerow, some of them are hundreds and hundreds of years old, and they're this incredible preservation of biodiversity. And there's, incredibly functional object that's living, doesn't need a huge amount of maintenance. And it's incredibly tough. And, if they get broken by some wind or an animal pushed through it, then, within a couple of years, it's kind of regrown and readapted. So I think, so the living materials have this really nice history that maybe isn't so obvious when you just first think about it.
Wow, I'm so excited to go and think about.
Sorry, that was a very long answer to your first question.
That was beautiful, Chris.
Thank you. You're going to be looking after some willow later today, right?
Well, that was one of the challenges. So I grew all these two willow chairs in buckets, so I could bring them down to London. But obviously I don't have a garden in London, so I've been kind of scavenging off friends, and they've been living in different people's gardens around London.
Well, I have a garden, so...
Oh, excellent. But the hardest thing is getting it, because they're quite wide, and all the doors in the UK are 80 centimetres wide. And these are 84 centimetres wide. But yeah, so Kew Gardens and the Royal Parks. Actually, I was meeting the Royal Parks this morning, and they are hopefully going to give them a home.
A forever home for the living tree.
Yeah, so a permanent home. They've been having a bit of a tough ride.
I thought I was going to get one, but... Okay, brilliant. Okay, so the next quickfire question is, what is the worst organism that you've had to work with?
So I feel really bad saying this, but genuinely I think it's humans.
Oof.
Ooh, that's a very interesting answer.
A very biodesign answer.
Go on.
Yeah. I think this, the project I've done out in French Polynesia, it was an exploration in both interspecies design, but also intercultural design. And the interspecies design, I was working with this bioluminescent microalgae, which is kind of present in the lagoons around the island out in French Polynesia, and developed this very close relationship with it as I was trying to understand what it needed to grow, what it needed to thrive, what it needed to kind of illuminate, and so on. And so I had this wonderful period of sort of learning to talk to this microalgae. And eventually over time I started to understand it, and I understood that it had its own circadian rhythm, and I understood, and that's, these, grab it. So these little, I call them watches, but I guess the only time they tell is biological time. But they're more biological kind of Tamagotchis. So I love that. These little, these bioluminescent microalgae, they kept dying on me. And obviously you've got no idea why, like what's happened to them. Are they going to be okay? The lights turn off in the middle of the night. So I decided to just take them with me, because the algae, they need both daytime and nighttime. They need a regular rhythm because they have their own circadian rhythm. If you take them on a plane on holiday, then they get jet lagged. So so it's kind of, they're fascinatingly alive. And so I made these little devices that I could wear, because I kind of came to the conclusion that they needed the same things as me. And so if I looked after myself, and if I slept enough and didn't stay up too late, then they'd also look after themselves. But kind of developed this very close relationship with the algae. But whereas the humans, God, I could kind of learn what these guys wanted, and I guess it was symbiotic. I guess it was mutually beneficial for both of us. They gave me light and joy, and in return, I gave them a space to grow. I hope. But working with humans, it's the emotional element, it's the conscious element that makes it so unpredictable and unknown, and trying to complete this intercultural project. And I think throughout the project, I think it's about 180 people who overall have contributed to my project in some way, who have I've had to put into in the credits somehow for the project. And just trying to, respect everyone's needs and wishes and beliefs and cultures. It's really challenging. And I was really lucky to be working with some amazing collaborators who were incredibly relaxed, incredibly kind, incredibly positive, which isn't always the case. But yeah, so for me, humans are by far the most complicated organism.
The biological Tamagotchi is actually a really beautiful form of connection.
The idea that also that if you care for yourself, it mirrors, and it's really nice.
Yeah, and I looking after houseplants, there's any kind of care process where you build a relationship. I think it's a really important thing to do, and it's something that you can't do with an inert, inanimate object. You can't. I don't know, maybe you polish your silverware or something, but you can't really build a close relationship with your table because it doesn't have a living element to it. And so I think that element of livingness is such a beautiful, beautiful state. And it's that fragility, it's the fact that it might die or it could die, it's the fact that it's on this knife edge that allows you to make such deep connections with it.
Do you think that learning to work with livingness is one of the more important parts of biodesign?
I think yes, as a biodesigner, you've got to learn that, but I think that's the bread and butter of what we're doing. I think if we're going to create objects or devices or materials that are going to go out into the real world and have impact, the bigger question is more how can the general public learn to interact with living things? So when I was meeting the Royal Parks team this morning out in Hyde Park, and they were telling me how after Winter Wonderland, they have to dig up the entire surface area of the park, and then they re-turf the entire park. And it's kind of a shocking thing, isn't it? That we create this temporary structure, which probably would, in the spirit of a market stall where something would have popped up and been there. But we've now kind of industrialized it to such this huge scale that we actually then have to completely re-turf this area of Hyde Park. And you think, that's it doesn't feel right. And so I think actually it's more about, as a biodesigner, thinking about how will the general public engage with this livingness. That's a much bigger challenge for us.
I think there are a lot of examples of that, like in terms of festivals and large gatherings of people in nature for celebrations that have that kind of impact on the land that is quite detrimental. So that is a massive challenge of how can we live with livingness at scale, at such a large scale. Because I mean, as biodesigners, as you were saying, right, it is a very precarious relationship when you're collaborating with your organism. And that on the scale of something just the size of Winter Wonderland is kind of even more terrifying, actually, like the damage that you could be doing by not caring for the space that you're with and the livingness that you're in a relationship with.
Yeah. And it's interesting. So my background in automotive engineering, I guess, was very interesting because my degree was in manufacturing engineering, and there you're trained to make everything as reliable and repeatable as possible. And Toyota have done the most amazing job in Six Sigma and all of their processes and methodologies for creating things that are really reliable and repeatable and high quality. And it was fun working at somewhere like Land Rover, actually, where you had to design for a certain level of abuse of your products. And it was amazing how scientific you can get about the abuse of a product. And what my favourite days at Land Rover, where you were doing things like curb tests, where you'd have to take a new Land Rover Defender prototype and you'd drive it into a curb at 50 miles an hour, because obviously no one would intend to do that, but someone might do it, and they'd expect their car to survive that in that situation. So you had to both, you were designing something to be incredibly repeatable and similar, so that you can meet everyone's expectations, but you also had to design it to cope with abuse. And one of the most fascinating things, we were doing a project with leather. So the leather seats in a car, the reason you get, I guess, on a more expensive car, what's the difference between the leather on a more expensive car and a very cheap car? Well, in the cheap car, the leather has been coated in lots of chemicals and essentially painted, because they use a cheap leather that's covered in scratches and covered in marks and maybe even a brand mark from the animal. And it's perceived that the consumer wants to have something that is completely homogeneous, repeatable and reliable. And so they paint the leather and they put this false grain into the leather so that it's completely consistent. As a result, you've got a leather that's kind of artificial and modified and not as durable and not as nice a material, but it's consistent. If you get onto a really high-end car, into a Rolls-Royce or a Range Rover, the leather is incredibly expensive because they have to find a perfect hide that's got no scratches, no marks, and no imperfections. And so it's fascinating that the industry has developed to say we must create something that's completely homogeneous with no character and no individuality, and as a result, we're almost, for me, we're sacrificing. For me, a leather that tells a story that's got scratch marks and details and personality is so much more valuable. But as a society, we've started to value something that's consistent and repeatable, because then, we can't have complaints. We can't have, someone not wanting a car or not wanting to buy a certain product because they don't like the way the leather looks. And so I think, our acceptance of ambiguity as a society, for me, is one of our biggest challenges at the moment. That's a much bigger topic to discuss.
Interesting.
Yeah, I guess there is like the value of imperfection with artisanal objects does exist at the moment. But then I guess an artifact of industrialization, well, not an artifact, but like the whole point of industrialization. And I think biodesign and biomaterials really butts up against that quite a lot. Like massive standardization can be quite difficult in like a biodesign space. And I think sometimes it's like, creating a process for creating a biomaterial kind of suggests maybe you shouldn't scale it up in the same way that you would like traditional industrial materials.
Yeah, and it's one of my biggest pet kind of peeves with the biotechnology industry is that I went to a fantastic presentation in January at the Biofabricate conference, and there was this big celebration because someone who was producing mycelium leathers was celebrating the fact they've just built this huge industrial facility I think it was in South Carolina, and that they were producing at this large scale using robotic production lines. And for me, we've totally kind of forgotten sight of the actual problem here. And if you've created a production factory that's producing the same material in large volumes using identical inputs and materials, it's exactly the same problems as the synthetic industrial materials, just in a different form. And biotechnology is so suited to being distributed. In France, there's something like 50,000 bakeries, and they bake 30 million baguettes every day. And so, biotechnology is designed to be distributed. It can work on a tiny, tiny scale. And so putting it all into one space and trying to scale it industrially, it's not how nature operates. And I think that's one of the challenges, is that as a designer, we can create maybe a new process or a new material, but actually where we really need to be thinking about is the system behind it, because nature operates differently.
I think that gets right back to your early questions of saying that humans are the hardest to work with, because maybe you've sorted out this really interesting biodesign or biotechnology solution, and then you have to take it to humans and change their systems and convince them and change minds, which it's just a whole other task on itself.
And it's why I think, I guess I've called my biodesign project Biocrafted, because I think craft for me holds a lot of potential. Craft is something that anyone can do in their own home. It's something that is, very personalizable, and everyone can develop their own kind of practice and process with it. And so for me, biology and craft go really nicely together. And craft, at the moment, I think you almost associate craft with something that's being lost. I discovered recently, a friend was telling me about there's a website that lists all of the kind of endangered crafts. And I really want to go and look at it, because there's so many. And she was saying, there's thousands of crafts that are endangered, that are sort of considered as the knowledge might be lost. And I feel, it's almost our responsibility to go and learn these crafts so we can keep them alive, so we can pass on that knowledge. And I think that's it's a potentially real looming crisis that I've never heard anyone really talk about before.
Yeah, I haven't heard of this sort of extinct craft issue before.
Oh, I feel like I come across this like every single day. Yeah. Oh, because as some people may know, I do like some textile design, like fashion work, and I typically use like indigenous West African textiles, and so many of those, there's like absolutely no information on them on the internet at all. So like you have to know somebody that knows about the materials, which kind of poses some issues when, as we were saying, right, there's this competition between industrialized materials and then craft and artisanal processes. And obviously one of them is the one that everybody wants because it's consistent and reliable in a certain type of way, and it makes a lot of money and it's cheap. So yeah, massively, I come across this dying craft thing quite often. And I think especially from like where I'm from in Sierra Leone, the information about craft is like very, very, it's very like hard to access. So you either have to know somebody, or you might find a book somewhere that was printed maybe like 50 years ago, and you might find some information in that. But yeah, and I think that obviously with Marama Ora that we'll get to very soon, you tackle that issue, and illuminate how those two things can exist in the future, even beyond industrialization, which I think is very, very powerful. And you actually hit upon one of our quickfire questions, which was the biodesign pet peeve. So
well done.
Very thank you much for that.
Shall we jump ahead a little bit and talk about your latest project? 'Cause I feel like there's so much to unpack in that, and I want to really get into the meat of it. So why don't you start by telling us, giving us sort of like an introduction to your latest sort of year-long kind of project.
Set the scene when you got to French Polynesia.
Yeah.
Tell us what it was like, the wind in your hair.
Yeah, a lot of people think it was just going there on a holiday, and it actually started out from this idea of if we divided up the world between all the human population who lived on it. We'd all have a little bit of land and a slightly bigger bit of ocean each that we were a custodian for. I mean, that's quite anthropocentric to say custodian, but that's kind of how I pictured it in my mind. And it turns out it's 2 football pitches of land and about 40 swimming pools of ocean. And did some searching on GIS, and there were a few, there's a few islands around the world that are that size, but one of them was right on the opposite side of the world in French Polynesia. And so I said, I'm going to go to this island because I want to see what it's like. What is this space of world that I have to, that I might have to kind of look after or live within. And I really like this idea of resourcefulness, of using what's around you, and particularly in island cultures. In the UK, we're an island here, but we have a lot of import and export as well. And actually out in French Polynesia, the islands are a little bit, they're much more aware of what comes and goes from the island. They're so remote that they have to be. And anyway, when out in French Polynesia, I became aware of this field of bioprospecting. So for every one microorganism that we know today, it's estimated there's about 100,000 microorganisms that we don't know. And they call this unknown microorganisms, they call it biological dark matter, which I think is it's the most wonderful concept. So I was really fascinated by this biological dark matter. And out in French Polynesia, in the atolls, there are these things called copara mats. And they're this sort of symbiotic algal mat that exists in the lagoon. And lots of people are interested in it from a bioprospecting perspective because they're quite unique environments. And in there might be anti-cancer drugs, there might be new antibiotics, there might be all sorts of interesting things there. And so I went out there and I applied to the French Polynesian government to get a bioprospecting license, which would allow me then to sequence the DNA of biological samples out there, and also to bring some samples of seaweed back to the UK, because I was particularly interested in, with the help of some researchers in Cambridge with a company called Bravely Cultured, looking at what microorganisms grew on seaweed as a feedstock. Seaweed's very plentiful, and it was kind of an interesting potential area. So we did that, and I kind of flew back with my cooler box filled with seaweed and took it through customs. But then kind of realised that, wow, it felt very much like we were recreating the mistakes of the past. Like I, as a white Western guy, had gone out to this island, had found these, seaweed samples and was taking them back to my country. And so then sort of said, okay, this doesn't feel right. How could maybe what we've mentioned before around this distributed nature and of biotechnology and craft, how could that be maybe a more appropriate way of using the biological resources we have around us? And particularly in places like French Polynesia, people are amazing at using what's around them. You'll be having a barbecue, and if someone needs a plate, they'll just go and grab a banana leaf out of a tree, and the stuff that people can weave from the different materials and plants that are on the island are just remarkable. So it felt like this really interesting connection of sort of saying, okay, what happens if this traditional knowledge of using these materials that are around us and the scientific advances in genetic sequencing and prospecting for organisms and so on, what if those two worlds came together and local people could start to work with the microorganisms that are on their island? And so that was where the project was born. And when it comes to living materials, there's a lot of really interesting applications, but generally it involves like slimy, invisible things. And so it was, looking at lots of amazing applications that could be really, changing for the world. But from a design perspective, the bioluminescent algae stood out as a way of creating something that really communicated about livingness and made it very understandable and relatable as a project. If I'd just gone to people and said, hey, let's make a slimy thing, it wouldn't have really made sense. Whereas when you can see it illuminating, it then, it really communicates what's going on. And it's also, we have this like biophilic, I don't know if either of you have swum with bioluminescence, but it's a very awe-inspiring, transcendent experience. It's almost like acknowledging you. Nature's kind of live talking to you. And actually, when you think about it, we love animals like dogs and cats because you stroke them and they move and they purr and you get this interaction. And actually, with a lot of living as a biodesigner, a lot of living organisms, you don't get that interaction. So it's very hard to build this engagement and connection with them. So for me, working with the bioluminescent microalgae, it was a very useful way of making it appealing to humans and making it an engaging project. So the artisans I was working with were really interested in working with it. There was a byproduct from that in that what I discovered about working with living materials is that by far the hardest thing is knowing that they're alive. And it sounds kind of funny, but if you want to know if something's alive, actually it takes some really expensive microscopy equipment and analysis to know if something's alive. And I didn't have access to that. Whereas with bioluminescent algae, and the living materials are made, I could just give it a poke, and if it lit up, it was alive, and it was I was like, okay, we're going in the right direction. So it allowed me to very rapidly evolve this material. I could almost make a new prototype every single day and see live how it was doing and how it was performing. So there was a really unexpected byproduct of the project, was being able to get this very quick feedback from this organism. And so, yeah, light became our way of talking, which was lovely.
Yeah, I think I remember you saying that light on the bioluminescence is a brilliant proxy for livingness. So you developed this bioluminescent material with microalgae. So what was it like when you brought that to the Artisans, and who are the artisans that you worked with?
Yeah, it was a really interesting experience because I think when I showed, I think it was actually this sample, and so I made this sample before I went back out there to French Polynesia, and when I showed people in Europe this sample and I said, this material's alive, everyone just didn't get it. And people would look at you like you're mad, and they're like, "Why do we want a living material? This doesn't make sense." But then, so I went out, and the conversation, I would just put this on the table in front of us, and I would say, I've been making this living material. It contains luminescent algae. It lights up when you touch it. What do you think of it? And it was amazing. They almost all immediately just got it. They immediately were like, "Oh, this is amazing! It's like we're in symbiosis with this organism. We're connected to it. You found a new form to put it into, and we could introduce this into our practice." So it was that was almost it was a surprisingly easy part of the project, and I think that comes because out in French Polynesia, they both through their cultural history. And also their day-to-day life, they have a much closer connection to nature. So a lot of the cultural stories and myths and legends that they tell, so many of them are about nature, and also their day-to-day lives. They'll be going out into the lagoon and swimming among the coral, almost every day. People really understood symbiosis and the living organisms. And then it was a real challenge because everyone had their practice, and it was working out how to integrate it. And this is a really new thing, and it's got lots of limitations. And I knew those limitations, and for them they didn't. They just wanted to run wild with it. So, for example, one of the collaborators, an amazing lady called Hinatea Colombani, and her husband Moe. And Hinatea is a costume maker and a dancer. And she saw this and she just said, "I want to have a costume that lights up when I dance. When we dance at night, I want to have something that illuminates and responds." And the vision of that was amazing. But this illuminates for maybe 20 seconds, then it needs a few minutes rest. I was pretty limited. In the lab, I could only kind of make an A3 sheet of it. I couldn't produce a whole outfit. And so. We designed this luminescent outfit, and I came back with the challenge to make it, and I just couldn't do it. So in the end, we had a backup, which was this this drum, which actually was much more suited to the scale. It suited kind of the intermittent way it was struck and illuminated and used. So there was this really interesting back and forth. So it meant, I guess, it was a very deep collaboration because there had to be this really close back and forth. And I was actually I lived with Hinatea for a few days. They very kindly put me up and stayed with me. And it's hard when you're trying to be creative and you don't want to put the brakes on something. So I didn't want to say to Hinatea, "We can't do a costume. This is going to be really, really hard." I didn't want to put those brakes on the project. So it was a really fine line to tread between realism and dreaming.
Yeah, I feel like this is a common tension in biodesign where the dream and the goal, especially for biomaterials, is so far ahead of what you're able to make, and it's trying to bring those two closer together at every point. But there's so many challenges to come to this like big imagined idea of what it could be with these very small, individual, precarious pieces of material.
Yeah, I think because biodesign it's not bioengineering, right? It's in a place where design is, you're building with nature to impact culture and everyday life and tell stories as well. And, biodesigners have big dreams. So it's, and this project was only about a year long. So it's kind of like, what can you do in that really short space of time? And you've done a huge amount. And there are clothes as well. There's the swimsuit, right?
Yeah. I didn't bring the swimsuit with me today.
Should have been wearing it.
No,
It was a missed opportunity.
That would have been great.
It has been interesting in London actually finding models who are prepared to kind of put on something that's quite an unusual garment. But I think it was very interesting when I was at the Biofabricate conference. Again, I was talking to the founders of the Biofabricate conference, so Suzanne Lee and Amy Congdon. Just amazing that the work that they've done. But one of the comments they made actually was the dangers that creating impossible projects can do to the industry. And it's something I think, that we have to be really careful of. Because if we sell a dream, if we create these concepts that are completely impossible or completely infeasible, it doesn't set good expectations among the general public, among the among the industry, because then it leads to this kind of constant perceived failure, and so I think it's a very fine balance. And actually, I had Amy's voice was ringing in my head throughout this entire project, saying, don't create something that's going to do damage. Don't create something that is infeasible or technically impossible or misguided, because you don't want to sell a dream that's not the right dream to be selling. And so it was very, I deliberately, when I created the project, a lot of people they talk about Avatar, the film, when they see my, the bioluminescent material. And that
I guess
was,
it is blue. That doesn't help.
And that was very intentional because I wanted to create this feeling of it being slightly surreal and being, is it real? Is it not real? Is it a dream that we're aspiring to, or is it something that's tangible? And so, while the material is real, I think it's going to take a lot of research to scale this up. And I think the actual value of what's developed here is not in making a bioluminescent material. And I've had lots of people request to say, "Oh, can we do an outfit for festivals?" Or I had a TV presenter wanted to use one of the biological Tamagotchis for an award ceremony a couple of weeks ago, and it was very hard because I said, here's the watch and you can wear it, but it's light in there, it's artificial, it's lost its circadian rhythm, it's been shaken around, it's not going to illuminate. But there was this real sense of disappointment when she was on the stage and she shook it and it didn't light up like it was made of kryptonite or something. And so that was really hard. I created a promise that in that form, it didn't fulfill what her imagination had delivered on that promise. Now, the real value for this, I think, actually comes not in bioluminescence. It comes in the other bioactive organisms that you could put into this material and what they could create. I think that's where the real value lies. But yeah, we need to be careful.
Okay. Before we take a step back and get some insight into how you got to this project, I want to ask one last question on the point that you just made about selling dreams and the dangers of that. As advice to new biodesigners, what would you say is a way to find the balance? And how maybe have you done that in this project?
Yeah, brilliant question. I think you need to almost... for me, I think when I started out this project, I set myself it's almost like some operating principles to go by. So the first thing was I said, it's got to be living. Because I've spent, 10 or so years designing, cars, shoes, outdoor equipment, all of which is dead and inert. And for me, it's in this constant state of degradation, which is really problematic for me. And so for me, the state of livingness is this dream that we should be shooting for. The second thing was photosynthetic. And I'd kind of discovered this wonderful statistic or estimation that the bacteria on planet Earth produce 27 times more CO2 than humans, which is actually not as bad as it sounds because, okay, we're in equilibrium, we're a system, and that's kind of fine that bacteria produce that amount of CO2. But equally, when you look at, say, the production of bacterial cellulose, bacterial cellulose isn't a free material that's produced by the sun. Bacterial cellulose is, you're just converting whatever sugar source you give to the microorganism, which is then transformed into cellulose. So it's very easy to think, because something is biological, it's free. But it's not. It depends on what you're feeding it. So for me, a big principle was to say, okay, I need to work with something photosynthetic, because then all I'm giving it is sunlight.
Oh, interesting.
And so, for example, these bioluminescent algae, they're photosynthetic. All they need is sunshine. I've had some living for almost 6 months now with no intervention, with no food. It just needs light.
Wow.
And so for me, that was a really important principle to operate with. And so, for me, it's setting out, it's working out what's your framework, what are your principles and your values that we want to operate on. And on the whole, I would say if you're working with something that's not photosynthetic, you need to be looking at what is this organism's superpower that can't be achieved in any other way. Is it the fact that it makes things at a really tiny scale? Is it the fact that it can, convert a really unique source of food into, or a waste into something that I want it to be? But you need to be thinking about what's its superpower and why am I making it do it? We can't just be using things as a substitute.
Thank you. So actually, you mentioned something about making inert materials for so long. So what I wanted to ask is, what was the point where you decided to step into the biodesign world? And as Kirsten likes to say, what radicalized you? Was it anything to do with making inert materials or inert systems and products, or was it something else or somebody else?
Yeah, so I was really lucky to have the opportunity to work on a lot of these projects that are at the forefront of sustainability. So that was at Jaguar Land Rover, and I was really lucky to be working on their new electric vehicle program, which is now the Jaguar I-Pace. And I think it really hit me on that project when we'd done all this amazing work. We designed this incredible concept of a vehicle, but based on the analysis, and this was we were kind of forecasting towards 2018 grid mix of electricity, but the numbers were saying that the lifetime impact of that car was going to be roughly the same as a 2-litre diesel car. And I was like, we've done all of this work and put all of this technology to create something that's kind of the same. And obviously, there's huge advantages in terms of emissions, in terms of air quality, in terms of the the futuring and the improvements that we'll have in the grid mix. So I'm not saying that electric cars are bad, but at that time, it's actually not as much of a leap forward as we think. And the same went for a lot of the recyclable shoe project that we worked on. When you're looking at the benefits of making something recyclable, probably you're looking at a reduction of impact that 10% or less. You might be able to get more than that, but typically recycling a material will only reduce the impact by 10% or less. So you can go to a huge amount of effort to building these recycling systems to create whole new ways of consuming a product, but actually the benefit is relatively incremental. And for me, the sort of the target that always stuck in my head was that we need to halve our emissions by 2030. So that was the UN target, halving our emissions by 2030. Now that's an enormous change. And when you're dealing with maybe a 10% improvement, that's no way near the 50% reduction that you've got to aim for. And I think it's going to be very interesting to see over the next, now it's only 6 years. At the time, it was 10 years. But a lot of companies have committed to science-based targets. A lot of companies have committed to halving their emissions by 2030. And I think there's very few businesses out there that have any idea how they're actually going to do that. And I think that's because, the innovations, a lot of the innovations that are, that we really value at the moment around recyclability or whatever it might be, we're talking about very incremental changes. So for me, the inspiration to start working with nature was to say, I think nature is the way we can get to real, a step change. The other element there as well was, I guess, why biodesign? So bio, I think nature does it better. Design, the other factor is the human. And the largest impact of a product is actually the human part of it. Why did they buy it? How long do they own it for? Do they repair it and care for it? And for me, the easiest way to halve the environmental impact of something is just to double its lifespan.
That's a very good point.
And that's by far the simplest way. If we can get someone to wear a pair of trainers for twice as long as they would have before, okay, it doesn't work out quite at half. There's some complicated factors there, but roughly it's much easier to imagine doubling the lifespan of something than halving its impact. The other way would be to use half as much material, which I think is another great approach. And I think we have a lot of excess in our designing processes today. But so the reason for biodesign, I think nature does it better, and I think humans are the key part of the equation that we need to be playing with. And that's why I think for me biodesign is such an amazing subject, because you're playing with those two. For me, those are the two biggest levers that we can pull as a designer.
I think you raise a really important point in terms of, in order to meet these huge targets, if you're not engaging with radical, big change, it's just not enough. And I think that's a really nice lesson to just keep in mind for when you're making biodesign projects.
Definitely. I think actually there's a lot to learn from the world of marketing, because in marketing, they're really good, and particularly a subject like behavioral economics, they're really good at making very, very tiny changes that have an enormous impact on human behavior. And that, I think, as a radical act, I think we can learn a lot from subjects like behavioral economics, where we can make these tiny changes as a designer, and they'll completely change the way a human interacts with something. And I think that's a very interesting space for us to seek inspiration from as a designer.
So I guess that's and you have experience in marketing spaces as well, right?
Yeah. I think I was very lucky. I was qualified as an engineer, but in all the roles that I worked in, I always drifted towards marketing. And I guess that was my own desire to maybe start affecting how something is consumed and purchased rather than the engineering behind it. But I think it's also a much more dynamic, interesting, creative space to operate in. But it meant that I was able to see the world of marketing, and I think I've learned a lot from being immersed in that side of it. So I ended up at Salem, and my job title at the end was marketing and concept manager. And the idea in that role was to be able to to do all of the listening, so to understand your consumers' needs, understand the business needs, to create an idea, and then to be able to deliver that idea all the way through to the market. And I think, in businesses, you end up with a lot of these times where you get a vision and then it's handed over, and then you get something that's developed and it's handed over. And it's like this game of Chinese whispers. And by the time it gets to the end, you've got this real kind of donkey of a project. Whereas the idea there was to be able to take, having marketing as a consistent voice right from the very beginning, this role of product management essentially, is, I think, really important in delivering a powerful concept and a powerful product.
Yeah, consistency of vision that doesn't have the opportunity to break at any point in the chain of product development.
And particularly when it comes to biodesign, you're creating something that is new and radical, that is thought about differently. And if you were to hand that over to someone, you can very easily dilute the principles behind a project. And I think that's hard, because I think it means as a biodesigner, you've got to be incredibly versatile. Because actually, as a biodesigner, you really need to be able to cover all parts of the spectrum. And how do you develop the skills to be able to know about consumer insights, to know about biological research, to know about manufacturing and production, to know about commercialization? It takes a lifetime to learn all of those skills. And so I think a big challenge as a biodesigner is either, I guess, how do you learn about those subjects enough, or how do you get the help from people in those different parts of it, and accept that, probably as a biodesigner, we're going to have to be these real integrators and connectors that bring together loads of different skills to make a project a reality.
So like, as a biodesigner, it's important to aim to be a generalist in some sense?
I think you have to be. I think, I'd love to do some brain scans of biodesigners, but I imagine that, we're developing a very interesting part of our brain that is like this very big bridge between left and right side of the brain, because you're constantly having to jump between, science and logic and the creative process. And there can't be that many fields in the world where you're having to, it's absolutely exhausting. Like neither side of your brain gets a rest. So yeah, I think, it takes really versatile, polyvalent people. So I think, hopefully biodesigners are sort of the re-emergence of Renaissance people. These people who can kind of turn their hand to everything and explore everything and be really curious and open-minded. And with that, you can't be afraid of failure, because pretty much everything you're doing, you're going to be a beginner at it. So you've got to have a really good mindset.
So with failure, as you just said, how would you approach something as to not be afraid of failing in a biodesign project?
Yeah, it's wonderful question. I think just be kind. Both be kind on yourself and be kind to other people, and ask other people to be kind to you. You can't ever go into somewhere assuming you know something. And I think one of the biggest things I've learned from working with living organisms, I personally believe, and I know this is quite a challenging belief, but I think that we shouldn't have any expectations of something else. And people can get really angry if someone doesn't do something for them. But I think, you need to flip that on its head, and you need to say, okay, why didn't I create an environment where that outcome occurring was inevitable? Because if you're growing a plant, if your plant doesn't grow into a beautiful, gorgeous, blossoming tree, then you're going to say, okay, well, maybe I didn't water it enough, or maybe I didn't give it enough sunlight. Whereas for some people, if my partner didn't make me breakfast this morning, well, I didn't, maybe you didn't make it desirable for him to make breakfast for you this morning. Like, why is there that expectation on someone else to do something? And so I think, in biodesign, you're always doing that, because you're always coming in as this stranger. You're always coming in as, this outsider who's probably asking a favor, who's probably asking someone to do something a little bit differently. And it was very interesting getting to collaborate with the Francis Crick Institute as part of my project. I was really, really lucky to have the opportunity to collaborate with them. But we had these completely different ways of working. And it took us almost, from the start of the project to me actually having to be able to do stuff in the lab, it was actually 4 months. Because we kept having process of me saying, I kind of want to do this thing. And they'd say, okay, where's your experimental plan? Where's your literature review? Where's your exhaustive research of everything that's happened? And obviously they're doing that because from a biomedical perspective, it's really expensive to work in the lab. And so you do everything you can to exhaust every other opportunity before you start playing in the lab. Whereas a biodesigner, we're kind of on this path of uncertainty. We're
start with play.
Yeah.
You get to the lab.
And we're surfing on this edge of chaos all the time, not really knowing where we're going. And obviously, the Grow Lab at Central St Martin's is amazing, because the technicians in there, Barbara, Shem, Paula, they've got used to this, and they kind of know that we're going to come in, not really knowing why we're doing something, but sort of giving it a go, and we're going to learn along the way. That's not how the typical scientific industries work. So it took us, it was 4 months of this back and forth, and eventually we kind of met in the middle, where I came in with a more robust experimental plan, and they were a little bit more open to just whatever was going to happen. But that took a lot of kindness on both sides. And, you'd have a lot of really frustrating conversations where I feel like we've just talked about the same things over and over again, and, we haven't made any progress. But from both sides, it was coming to say, well, let's just be kind and just be open to seeing where this goes.
Thank you, Chris. I think be kind is a brilliant way to wrap up our first episode of Biodesign Now. And as per our closing tradition, we'd like to ask,
To whom
or to what?
would you like to dedicate this conversation to?
I think my greatest, for me, there are two things that I find most inspiring about nature. So the first one is symbiogenesis. And I think we don't give enough appreciation to the two, and maybe now more miracles that have occurred, where a bacteria, two microorganisms fuse together initially to create mitochondria to allow cells to create energy, and then photosynthesis when a cyanobacteria joined with another microorganism to create photosynthesis. None of our world around us would have been possible if those two chance happenings hadn't occurred. So, is that serendipity? Is it chance? It's probably chance. And also, there's some researchers who believe they found another symbiogenesis, which I think is amazing. But yeah, I think the other element I find of nature that's so inspiring is actually this concept of entropy. And entropy is this principle, this physical principle that everything moves towards a state of disorder. So, and any structure we have moves to unstructure, and it's actually Schrödinger. So, in all of this research about life and living materials, I was looking a lot at what is life. I got completely stuck. First assignment at biodesign is you have to write something about what is life. I got stuck there. I got stuck on level 1 biodesign on what is life. And for me, I looked at all the definitions, and in the end, the best definition I found was Schrödinger, the physicist, who also somehow dabbled in biology. He wrote an amazing book called What is Life, which if you think about the time when it was published in the early 1900s, the stuff that he covers in that book is incredibly forward-thinking. But he defined life as anything which defies equilibrium.
That's beautiful.
I ended up really hanging on to this because I think what does that imply? Well, it implies that life is the only thing that can really push against this constant decay and constant chaos, disintegration of our world. And so life is the only thing that can push against that, which gives a great appreciation for life, that life is the thing that's reversing inevitability. But then for me, the other thing is it almost says, okay, what's our obligation as a living thing? Because for me to be alive, I need to be going against equilibrium. I need to be challenging the convention. I need to be pushing against the flow. And I think as a designer, that's an incredibly motivating thing to say, how can I be the most alive by pushing the most I can against equilibriums? And so that, for me, I think it would be an ode to, for me, I dedicate this to life and our ability to push against equilibrium.
Wow, that's a beautiful answer.
That is beautiful. Oh. Thank you very much, Chris.
Thank you so much, Chris.
Yeah. And thank you to Huddle Studios for allowing us into their beautiful podcasting space.
And thank you to you two for creating this biodesign podcast, because there's not really anyone out there who's really, creating a podcast around this subject. So I'm really excited to see where you take it and who you interview in the future and how you can raise awareness of this really weird but brilliant discipline that we found ourselves in.
Yes, we need more biodesigners in the world, I think.
Definitely.
Yeah, and people who can put up with all the questions you get from your parents and friends. What actually is biodesign? So I think we get pretty good. I think that was one of your questions, was what is biodesign? And
it was.
As a biodesigner, one thing you can be sure of is that you're going to ask that question a lot.
So what is biodesign? As our final question.
I always say to people, it's mixing biology and creativity. And it's as broad as that. And then people say, oh, well, what does that mean? I said, well, okay, it can be any kind of creativity. It can be architecture. It can be product design. It can be art. It's any form of creativity that you then mix with a living thing. So that's how I define biodesign.
I think that's a very clear and succinct. That's probably one of the most clearest and like straightforward answers that I've encountered. So thank you very much for that. If anybody was confused during this conversation, now they're not.
Excellent.
All right, brilliant. Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Thanks.
Oh, where can we find you next?
So I'm trying to gather this mad collection of projects. So you can follow me. It's bio.crafted on Instagram or biocrafted.com. And that's where I'm trying to collect together all of this research and experiments. And it's great. I seem to be getting quite a bit of traction. So all of these mad experiments, which to everyone seems really disconnected, but for me, there's so much connection between them. They all seem to be getting a lot of traction, whether that's the work with living willow to create functional objects, the projects I've got trying to replace vinyl window displays with soil, or the work with living materials and the intercultural collaborations, which, I don't know where I'm going to take that project. Marama Ora, it's got some really interesting angles in terms of traditional knowledge and indigenous intellectual property. So in May, the World Intellectual Property Organization filed a new ruling that all genetic resources and traditional knowledge must be acknowledged in any intellectual property that's filed, which is a real breakthrough in terms of that space. And it's really interesting. My project covers both of those subjects. It contains traditional knowledge, it contains genetic resources. So it's a very... I guess my project is a nice thought experiment for people in that space and industry to work with. So I think it's going to evolve a little bit there. I'd also love to, develop the material, and there's a few brands who are really interested in exploring either the bioluminescent side or what could living materials do for them. And so there's lots of potential to take it in either direction, and then also to deepen the cultural collaboration. So the plan is to take all the objects back to Tahiti. And it was quite nice, one of my collaborators, Tokai, I was very nervous about, are we doing this right? Like, am I Captain Cook? Am I causing, am I doing really bad things here? And he put me at ease, not quite as much as I wanted to, but I was hoping he'd say like, no, this is perfect. But what he said was, no, this is like colonialism 2.0.
Okay.
And he said, this is where we're collaborating on an equal level to showcase something. And, we're going to showcase these things in London. We're going to showcase these things in Tahiti. But he said, like, I'm really excited for 3.0. And we never got to the bottom of what 3.0 was. But, for him, this was the next step, but not the final step.
Yeah.
And I think that was a really, it's really nice to think about, okay, where do we take this next? So yeah, there's also a real cultural collaboration element to keep evolving as well.
I'm really excited to see where you take that. Thank you very much, Chris.
Thanks, guys.